a little bit about how I started getting interested in this and all of the many, many interesting aspects of this company as it relates to Titusville. There we go. So tonight we're going to look at several topics. Just the intro, I'll talk to you about how did I get to this story? Why was this story interesting? Why did it capture my attention? And looking at this company's manufacturing origins, because it really is a wonderful manufacturing story, and yet one that's fairly typical, I think, of Titusville in this time period. So we're going to look at how it's representative in some ways of other trends. We'll look at its innovations and expansions, which are really spectacular compared to a lot of other manufacturing plants and even specifically Radiator plants. We're also going to look at the family of T.C. Joy and how this was not just about manufacturing, but like so many Titusville ventures, the family is here, they are integrated into the community, they become a valuable and important part of that community, and you will see many of the same family names over and over if we were to do a series of these talks about different manufacturing and enterprises in Titusville. And then looking last at what does this tell us from a bigger picture, from a historian's perspective, what are the trends that we might surmise, maybe things that we could research later using a larger number of resources to say, now that T.C. Joy, was he really different, or was this something that was very representative of Titusville history and oil region history for that matter? Because T.C. Joy was here initially because of the oil interest that he had in coming and wanting to speculate, which he did apparently rather poorly. So he had to move on to something else. All right, so let's get started first with where this story begins. How did I get interested in this? Well, this is my house here, my family's home on the left, and it's maybe one that some of you have been in Titusville. It's the one on the corner, in the northwest corner of Monroe and Main. And I think the last owner was Dr. Dentist Martin, Dr. Martin, and then a whole slew of other folks that lived there because it wasn't cut up into apartments. Now our family foolishly has attempted to put it back and live in it as a single family home, which has been challenging on many levels, from the many, I'm not sure what you call them, gaggles of bats, herds of bats, what are they? Many bats, lots of problems with the water, the plumbing, etc. But it's all been a grand adventure, and we have a picture of my younger daughter as we were moving in. She kept saying, when are they going to put up the sold sign? And she was about 3 years old, and I've got a picture of her holding the sign and pointing, and she was so proud that we were moving into what she had dubbed, and it's remained, the big giant house. So in the big giant house, we found these radiators. And I want you to understand, if you haven't lived with radiators, it's sort of like having another child, particularly the boiler. The boiler gets sick a lot about 4 a.m. And you know this, like any parent, you wake up, right, when your child's sick. They cry, or worse, they're not making any sound at all. So when you wake up at 4 a.m. and there's not that sound you're expecting, a little pinging, a little banging, a little hissing, nothing. You say, well, are you going to the basement or am I? One of you goes to the basement, you kind of jiggle the wires, try to convince it to start back up. So we got really acquainted with steam heat, because in this house we have T.C. Joy radiators. And so this is an example, and I actually have a little video. I want you to hear how this sounds if you haven't heard steam radiator. So let's see if we can get that. Now, it's not, or it shouldn't be, steam coming out of the radiator. What should be coming out of the radiator when you hear that noise? Well, nope, not heat. Not heat. What should be coming out? What's in the radiator before heat? Cold air. So what that steam fan is supposed to do is, sorry, I got a little creative here and it didn't really work. I'm not a videographer. Thank you. What it's supposed to do is push the cold air that's in the radiator since the last time the heat cycled. And then it's supposed to clamp shut when the steam enters and goes up to that vent. If it doesn't, if it sputters and spatters and water comes out or steam comes out, well, it's a nice humidifier, you're also kind of wasting, it's not doing what it's supposed to do, because the radiator is supposed to become full of steam until it starts, why are they called radiators? Radiating the heat out. So many people say, oh, steam boilers are so inefficient, they only run at 72 to 82% efficiency compared to my 99% efficient gas-forced air ream. And I'll say, well, one, does your cat spark into flames when it walks by from your gas-forced air? And they're like, well, yeah, it does. I'll say, two, yes, on the surface, we tend to think of that heat as not very efficient because the boilers have to attain such a high temperature to achieve steam. But the radiators themselves maintain that heat much longer than the gas-forced air cycle. When we first got these things working, which was a trial, and it was October, and it wasn't that cold. We got them working, the steam radiators are coming on, everything's working, and then they stopped. And then 20 minutes later, they turned on again. And then they stopped, and I thought, well, this isn't right. I'm not an expert, but I know this isn't right. So I go online, it's like 8 o'clock on a Friday night. I find some literally called Old Guys, Dead Guys Club, and it's a listserv website of people who like old heat systems. And I type in, is this short cycling, what's it doing? And some guy within 8 minutes says, your modern thermostat is preset for gas-forced air, which cycles 3 times an hour. And so you have to figure out if there's a steam setting on it, which it will not say steam. You have to find the handbook. Of course, we bought the house, we don't have the handbook. I go online, I find the handbook, and there's this list of instructions. First, look for a red blinking light, then press the number 3 6 times, and if it blinks green, then put in a 24. But if it doesn't, then you need to put in a 2. I thought, well, this isn't gonna work, but I did everything it said, and it didn't say anything to me, so I just stared at it and started cycling every 2 hours. So we found the steam setting. The fact is that old steam radiators weren't meant to cycle at all. How were they originally fueled? What's in the bottom of your old basements that you stumble across? Coal. The coal furnace that's constantly fed, so you don't have that cycling, that unnatural cycling that you have with modern equipment. So we learned a lot about radiators in trying to get them to work. And the thing is, with the sound and the touch and the beauty, as you saw that radiator is exquisite, it's a lot of fun. It's a real physical thing. And I think that in the digital world we live in, that a lot of people yearn for that kind of history. They still want to have the part of history that you touch and feel and understand and hear. So, get a D for my tech skills. There we go. So, the story of T.C. Joy Company in Titusville is brief if you count just T.C. Joy's era. But he actually then sells later to what will become Titusville Iron Company. Familiar, and then Titusville Iron Works, although they sold off the radiator part in 1899. So around 1860, T.C. Joy arrives into Titusville. I think it was actually 1865 he got here. And before that, he had been working as a hardware kind of salesman. And we'll look at that in a few minutes. And he actually speculated for 15 years. He did oil speculation and apparently it didn't go well. And so he had to look for some other way of making a living. And he had apparently messed around with creating some sort of heat stove for his house, which is not always a good thing, right? But apparently he knew what he was doing, and he was able to create something that he thought heated the house really well. Now keep in mind that before full house radiator systems, you were in that world of let's heat this room right, and sit there. And now we're going to go to this room. Let's put on the fireplace. Or if you're in a lot of the homes in this area, you didn't have a full wood-burning fireplace. You had these kind of insert things or stoves, or if it's Edwardian, the ceramic tile, you pour oil on and you light it. And some of them heated efficiently throughout several rooms, but I don't think anybody had that modern expectation that my whole house will be heated at a really warm for the whole time, until we had better heat systems. So he really was at the forefront in many ways of thinking about how to achieve that in what really was a Western kind of where we're out back, in that time period. Although, if you look at the Sanborn maps for around the time when he was here, we had 5,000 more people population than we do now, 10,000 people. So in 1889, he sort of formalizes what he's doing. He had began to experiment and began to make radiators from the 1880s, but then he creates this company with Daniel Colstock as a partner, and they create the T.C. and Joy Radiator Company, and immediately after that, things take off. He will start creating patents for new types and shapes of the cast iron. Now, these are cast iron, right? So cast iron and wrought iron are two different things. Blacksmith among us, can you explain that? Anybody? What's the difference between cast iron and wrought iron?
Iron,
Right.
if you make an alloy, it's like you make a cake mixture, you mix it in flour, sugar, and everything else. Iron, the element, you get alloy, carbon, you get carbon steel. You have less than 2% carbon steel, you're what I would as blacksmith. Above 2% is pig iron coming out of blast furnace. That can be cast, it can be shaped in molds that's fragile like an eggshell. It's incredibly fragile. These things are probably incredibly fragile. As a blacksmith, I can't do anything with cast iron. It's just cast.
Right, once they are compromised,
right,
you don't have any options. I have read online many different ways to try to fix them, none of which work. You're correct. You cast them in a mold, sand mold or whatever mold you're using, and then it's a one-piece deal. Now, in his case, you're going to mold what's called a fin or a section, and so you mold the sections and then they're connected together with bolts. So the good news is, if you do have an old radiator and you only get a hole in one section, it is actually theoretically possible to pull those apart, remove the fin, and put them back, but that would be a lot of work. So most people just source another radiator. However, in the case of these radiators, they're hard to come by. So yes, they're cast iron, not wrought iron, and so they have pros and cons in terms of they're tremendously heavy. If even a small one is going to be at least 200 or 300 pounds, and then the larger ones very heavy. So he goes, and we'll talk about the patents in a few minutes and his innovations. He does begin to expand by the 1890s, and by 1895, he has died. So this is a very short trajectory. However, it continues with a merger to Titusville Iron Company, and then in 1899, the radiator piece will go. So that's our timeline, what we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth for the next few minutes, and just looking at what's the story of how they evolved, and then we'll look at the family side, and then we'll go above and sort of make some analysis. So if you look at the census information, the 18th census, he's listed as a hardware merchant in New York. He and his wife lived there. They had one son, and those folks all came together to Titusville in 1865. And in his early years in Titusville, he left the hardware world and decided, I'm going to speculate. So for about 15 years, he tried this. It cost him a lot of time and money, but apparently, this guy had to be very clever. He had to be very someone who was always thinking, because he clearly wanted to invent. And that's what I see in common with a lot of these folks in Titusville in the late 1800s, is they had that, whatever it is, je ne sais quoi, that passion and that innovation, that from the oil fields through to many other types of manufacturing into the 20th century, where we see Titusville leading in areas like tannery and wallpaper production, all sorts of areas. For a small place, we were very important economically in our region. So after some years then, he created this heater, and he said, this is a great idea. I'm going to try to market this. And he finally developed a method for casting. And of course, if you know much, sounds like we got a blacksmith or a welder here in the back. You know, you don't do that at home, despite, what's the show my husband's always watching, where they make knives at home in the garage? Thank you. Forged in fire. Well, you don't do radiators, it's too much, so you have to create a place that's safe. And so after some years, he teamed up with Daniel Colstock, and they formed the TC Enjoy Radiator Company. Well, they had two different locations. The earliest location you can see here on the 1887 Sanborn map, which is a scale-drawn map with color coding. These are available for free for Titusville on the Penn State website if you ever want to see them. They're also on dp.la, the Digital Public Library of America, for free, and there are some on the Library of Congress site for free if you're interested. You will sit for hours the first time you download a Sanborn. It's page after page of scale-drawn Titusville, and you can compare, 1887 to 1895 to 1915. It's a great tool that we use at the Heritage Center when people come in with questions about the origin and date of their home, because we can compare the drawings and see if that gives us some clues to whether the house was there or not, or if it was changed. You'll notice here that they had a very intricate setup. You can see the overall designation. And let me just show you what you're looking at here. This is the close-up, and this is the outline shape of the steamworks on the bigger map. So it's, help me out. I even drove by it tonight. I'm like, well, where was it? It got destroyed in the fire and flood. After he moved, he got lucky. So it's not there anymore, but it's between, the park and down Mechanic, and so Mechanic isn't really there. Is it there, kind of? I mean, is it a turn-in now? I'm not sure. And then St. John's is lower in the creek. So somewhere in there, and I don't know that the train tracks are in the same place, so that may not be helpful, because I got very confused looking at it.
Mechanic is just this side of the Titusville Ironworks, and it doesn't go all the way through the area.
Okay, so if it's, yeah.
So the train tracks are probably the ones on the north side of the ironworks.
Okay, all right, yeah, so it's not there anymore, but that gives you an approximate idea of where it was. This is flipped the other direction, but I wanted you to be able to read it, so. You can see on these maps, they do indicate where there's a boiler, what the different parts of the shop were, because these maps were made by fire insurance companies who were interested in being able to determine the correct fire rating and assess then the insurance amount that you would need to pay. So if you had a boiler with iron doors around it, separating it from the rest of your wooden factory, then it's going to be cheaper than if you stuck that boiler, which the early ones were, the high pressure boilers, the commercial ones were prone to explosions. So before they got, what's the loop? I always forget the name of the loop. They got the loop on them. That helped a lot with decreasing the pressure. Now, boilers and steam in your home in residences are low pressure. They should not run over 0.5 psi in the basement. Obviously, as they go up higher, they're going to measure higher pressure. So, had a coal shed and all sorts of, if you see the bigger map, if you're curious and you go home tonight and you're like, I'm going to look at those Sanborns. There's all kind, there's a coal race, RACE, that's above ground. That's water. It looks like a waterway. Now, I've always heard there's an underground coal race, REIC, under Titusville. That's a tunnel with tracks where they used to deliver coal, and I can't, Tim Lorenz always told me it was there and he's been in it, but I can't get anybody now to get me into that coal race. The Franklin one has collapsed, but there is still one going east-west, apparently. Haven't seen it. And then, of course, Spring is underground now, so it looks very different on that side of town, because Spring Street used to be where it was a spring and a creek, and, now it flows, it's underground. So anyway, all of this to say, they had their first shop over kind of on the west side of town, and good for them, they moved a year before the fire and flood because that got destroyed. They needed more space, and they needed more ability to create and cast, and so they moved over to, here's the big map. So it's over sort of where Side Temp was later. And this building is, so you can see there's Spring, and there's, coming down, sort of just past the football field. And on this building, I think one of these is still there and used. Yeah.
Say, when I worked at Cyclops, they said that coal mill and part of another building was part of that radiator.
Yeah, that's
what you're looking at on that side.
yes, on that side over there.
Right side, yeah.
Was there anything in there that reminiscent of that, or had all been cleaned out?
He'd never know, just
Yeah.
a flat floor, the windows and walls and the floor.
Yeah.
And the roof.
That's too bad. That's what I've heard.
Nothing building.
Yeah.
Other than what Cyclops had it.
Right. Yeah. And it was there for a while, because even after T.C. Joy died, there's a end of the story. I did want to talk about expansion and innovation, though, during T.C. Joy's tenure, because places like the Waldorf Astoria were buying these radiators. There's one ad and in the county history for Pennsylvania, for Crawford County, it says that the Prince of Wales installed them in Marlborough House. Now, I have spent a considerable amount of time trying to confirm that, but so far I have had no luck with the British Archives. I got to the right place, but it's just, you have to go there and read for a week or two to figure it out. And I can't find, there's actually a section of the British Museum that is reserved for decorative arts, and this kind of falls in between. It's not really the kind of thing like artwork and costuming and rugs that they would have been in the museum side, keeping track of, and on the other side is paper trail. So they did keep track of the heating and the changes in the royal houses, but you have to go through the archive yourself. They don't put it online. So I got a big dead end on that, but I like to believe that for whatever reason, the Prince of Wales, living in the most advanced industrial nation in the world at the time, decided to buy our radiators. So I heard something about one of the Edwards, and that he was a little bit different, and he always was inviting the commoners in and having rabble-rousing parties, and maybe he met somebody from the U.S. and thought this was really cool. I don't know, but that's one of the stories. We do know they were in the Pennsylvania, one of the early Pennsylvania railroad stations. There's documentation of that in the trade journals. In this time period, if you're interested in manufacturing history, if you go on Google Books, all kinds of trade periodicals have been digitized, and they're available for free. And they'll have things like these guys' obituaries, a whole article when the banks fell. So it'll have little notations and classified in briefs whenever something new is introduced. The Kerr Mill out there by Walmart, we found a really cool full-page story with a picture of what it looked like when it opened. And so these trade journals are amazing resources that are often not caught because they're maybe digitized in Toronto or by a university in California who happen to have them. So Google Books is your friend when it comes to manufacturing history. At the old plant, they had offices and agents in New York City, in Pittsburgh, and Cincinnati, and Kansas City. Again, briefly, but they had people representing their products. They had catalogs. Haven't been able to get a hold of one of those. If anyone ever finds one, would love to see it. They had product catalogs. Employed about 90 people at the old plant, and over 100 to 150 at times at the new plant. There were some grumblings and rumblings from the employees in the newspaper, some complaints that they weren't being treated properly in some cases. And in other cases, you hear, when somebody retires, they'll say, oh yeah, that's one of the places I worked, was the TC Joy factory, and it's in the paper, tracing their career, and they seemed fine. So I think like any place, they probably had pros and cons. At that time period, all this safety regulations weren't in place, so I suspect there probably were accidents that were very unfortunate, but it seemed like people were getting employment and they appreciated that. In the 1890s, they had about 12 tons of castings daily, about 350 radiator sections, and a typical radiator section is about 38 inches tall, 37, and then the width of your radiator varies by how many fins you put together, how many sections. Sections, depending on the radiator, vary. And about 9 inches deep, unless you have an under window one, and then they tend to be more like 12 inches deep. And by 1889, they were melting 20 tons a day and 20 to 25 million feet of radiators annually. That's a lot of radiators, which I assume they trained out of here and why they were originally by the tracks. But really impressive numbers. And these were pieces of art if you bought the really high-end ones, which happened to be what's in my house. We had a guy contact us from California that had similar ones to mine. They spray painted them all bright gold, but they were flashy and they were beautiful, and they said, do you guys want to buy them? We're like, yeah, we can't really ship how many pounds of radiators from California, and Kelly's going to tell me there's nowhere to put them in our museum space. So we had to decline, and we asked them later what happened with them. Did they still have them? And he said, no, a collector from Germany purchased them. They went to Europe. So these are recognized as really beautiful pieces of art, not just functional. And did you know that in 1889, if you bought a new radiator and you just had your house, repapered, that you would paint your radiator to match the paper? I've seen pink, lime green, blue. You would see the radiators as part of the decor. And so radiators were painted to match wallpaper, which nowadays are all like, aren't they gold? And I'm like, no, they weren't. I don't know that they had bright gold paint in 1889. I doubt it. So a lot of people just let them go natural, kind of clean them down, and they have just that cast burnish look. But you can paint them. That is historically accurate. So some came with wrought iron grid caps, or actually these were, the one in our collection is a cast iron probably, but anyway, it's a gridded cap that goes on. And you know that a lot of radiators in the 20th century, people would buy the boxes to go over them, the covers, which is nice if you have kids, because these things are hot. They will burn you. But the TC Joy ones were clearly made not to be boxed in with all that ornate finish. And so this is a description out of the newspaper. I know it's hard to read, but it's talking about some of the early TC Joy radiators. The scroll work is beautiful, and the painting and decorating, so they're decorating these, they might be different colors, is beautifully done, artistically done by one of our Mr. James Orwig's artists. They're employing an artist to paint their radiator, so these are not just a functional item. There was one of white enamel, one of pink enamel, one lavender. Okay, there is a gold bronze, and I can't read that other one, something bronze, a green bronze, and a silver bronze. Copper bronze, yes. And trimmed to correspond. There are elegant specimens of hot water and steam. They made both hot water and steam. So hot water radiators need two pipes, because they come in one end of your radiator, they circulate through, just like your baseboard heat, circulate down, and again, it heats up the metal, and it runs at a much lower temperature. Steam radiator has to achieve steam. It comes into the radiator, and it can either come in one pipe and out the second, or it can come in one pipe, and you have have to have your radiator slightly tilted. It condensates and goes back down the same pipe. And that's called a one-pipe system. That's what I have. They're older than the two-pipe systems. If you have someone tell you, oh, I can change that one pipe to hot water, they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, you generally cannot. It's not piped correctly. And so, but the two-pipe you often can. But keep in mind, if you're sourcing an antiquarian one, and they're used to running at 0.5 psi their whole life, and you put hot water in that can go up to 12 psi, you may spring a few leaks. So I don't consider it a good bet to change. Then we have to consider how T.C. Joy was innovative with his patents. He had many patents. Actually, he started out in 1880 with some sort of stove patent to deal with his early work. And then he went on to patent variations in the way that the inner workings of these cast radiators were created. That he had what he called a ventilated flue. It was shaped differently that he thought allowed more surface for the heat. I've seen an article where they studied it and it didn't. And then I've seen one study that said they compared another well-known like Detroit radiator to this one, and the Joyrad was 20 degrees hotter a foot above the radiator. By the way, it was 160 degrees there. So it's very hot. He began patents for the design in the late 1880s, and it was good advertising. First of all, it's written up in all these trade journals. People read these trade journals, people who were purchasing items for their stores. They weren't just talking to each other. So there was a lot of hype about these radiators. They were considered special. And this is from the patent itself, explaining just a brief part of what he said. It's 2 or 3 pages. And these are, by the way, in our digital exhibit. We have a virtual exhibit of T.C. Joy Company up on our website that we share with Drakewell and the library and the High School Alumni Society. Excuse me, and it's Titusville PA Heritage Connection. So if you type that into your computer, you'll see this exhibit, and you can download stuff if you're interested in. It's not this PowerPoint, but it has more of the patent papers. And he says, he's writing this with this law team. Back then, you could write your own patent application. You didn't have to have 2 master's degrees, one of which is a law degree, and be a patent lawyer, which you have to employ now if you want to do patent. My improved construction of radiator sections gives an increased area of radiating surface at the lower part of the radiator and an additional amount of room for the air channels. So he goes on in very sort of technical sense, but also in plain language, explaining that you can heat more. It holds more heat. It allows more expansion of the heat. That was his argument. Okay, so we're going to leave TC for the moment. We'll come back to him because he's still alive and he's innovating at this point in our talk. But I want to turn to his family. Now, this is a picture of a structure in town. I'm sure some of you can identify. Anybody know what this is?